For a deeper dive into the design of bosses in Old School RuneScape, please welcome Mod Mack, Mod Rice, Mod Kieren, and Mod Arcane.
Thank you all for coming to the combat panel. I'm hoping everyone here just loves combat and Old School RuneScape as much as we do. I managed to get us a really good selection of JMods that have worked on combat for the past few years and maybe even a decade. So starting with myself, Mod Arcane, I've done things like TOA, DT2 bosses, Araxor, Muspa, quite a lot of the recent stuff. Then obviously we have the legendary Mod Kieren.
The legendary?
The legendary Mod Kieren. So obviously done TOB, Inferno, like all the really big hitters that have inspired us all.
Great Ulm and everything, Chambers of Zarek, like long history of combat in Old School.
Ulm's still one of the best bosses ever created, in my opinion. We have Mod Rice, one of our recent additions, but with Perilous Moons, absolutely smashed it out of the park. Fantastic update. And we have Mod Mack with the Colosseum, Desert Treasure 2 bosses, Tombs of Mascot. So I'm hoping that gives us a decent justification to talk about all the recent PVM within the game. I'm hoping to frame this talk as like our biggest strength in Old School is like iteration. We release stuff, we mess up repeatedly. You guys let us know, and we'll fix it, right? And we'll learn, we'll do better. And this entire talk is about what have we learned over the years? What has been really difficult? What have the challenges been? And how has that led us to where we are today? I can't remember what the slide is. The first one is. So yeah, we've got a couple of topics to talk about. It's going to be around 20, 25 minutes, very up in the air. A couple of topics like designing grindable bosses and Leagues 5 Echo bosses, things like this. We'll just go over them roughly, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions in the end, because as we all know, we love giving feedback on bosses and drop tables and everything else. There's a lot to talk about, especially with the recent blogs that were released yesterday. So, designing grindable bosses. I'll start, but I'll obviously deflect some questions. But this is one of the biggest challenges that I find that we have in Old School RuneScape. We've all played a lot of different games, like Elden Ring, Souls-likes. There's a lot of games out there that have these really big, epic bosses. And they're fantastic, they're really inspiring, they're really impactful. But not necessarily they're very fun, 5 times, 10 times, 100 times, 2,000 times. And when we've got pets like in our game, where you're killing the same boss 3,000, 5,000 times, it's really difficult to make that boss still fun. Right? That's the biggest challenge we all face. We've all had that one boss for the first 20, 30 kills, you absolutely love it, and then you've done it a couple of hundred times, and those frustration points really start to add up. And generally, we're pretty good about listening to feedback about that and trying to fix those bits. I don't know if you saw the announcements yesterday, but we're going to try and smooth out the Abyssal Sire. The Abyssal Sire is a bit of a janky one, so I think that's a case of us just trying to fix this and make them funner long term. But yeah, this is a really big challenge that we have. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Kieren.
I mean, honestly, imagine trying to design a boss for single use, right? Quest bosses, mostly you fight once. Things like the Inferno, you fight once. These are sort of just one-off challenges that you've got to overcome in different ways. The sort of boss design that works for those is so different to the sort of boss design that's going to work when, even worse if you go dry, right? We all hate going dry. Who hates going dry? And you have to kill a boss 1,000 times, you get sick of it. You've got to make a design fun to do it again and again and again. And none of them last forever, right? You'll get sick of them eventually. But Zook doesn't work 1,000 times. I mean, I know lots of people love it, but 1,000 times, it's designed to really overcome it, beat it once, feel like this insane feeling of satisfaction from overcoming that challenge. No matter how many times you've failed, it feels amazing. But yeah, it's a tricky part of our design problem.
And I think a bit of a retrospect there that I've had is Tombs of Mascot, I think, did a really good job of being the intro raid, of being getting you into that scene and learning it, and progressing through invocations can be fun. But in my experience, and I've talked to a lot of players about this, and I don't know if everyone here agrees, But the raid can get quite exhausting long term. A lot of the bosses demand a lot of attention from you all the time. Well, if you compare that to like Chambers of Xeric and Theater of Blood, eventually, once you get good enough, you can kind of turn your brain off, right? You can get into the rhythm, into the zone. And I think that's what every player is looking for. You eventually master it to the point where you can turn your brain off. I don't think TOA quite got there. All of those individual bosses demanded so much of you. They were almost standalone bosses, right? Well, I think in a raid, you want something a bit more low-key. I think Bloat is still one of my favorite bosses. Like, the fact it's so simple, it's effectively got like one, debatably two mechanics, and it's really engaging, it's really satisfying, but also you can just turn your brain off once you're very comfortable with it, unless your friends PK you. But yeah, one of our biggest challenges. League's 5 Echo bosses. So I worked with well done. I worked with Mod Rice and Mod Halo very, very closely on these, and I think it was a really good idea from the point of view of the League needs like an aspirational bit of content, right? Something to really focus towards. Like, it's really fun having like 30 DPS, killing goblins and Grardor, but eventually you don't really get to feel that DPS. So having these like bigger challenges was really satisfying to try and pull off. And I think one of the most interesting talking points from this point onwards is, what do we do with them now? There's been actually a decent amount of requests from you guys, like, could we replace the Kalphite Queen with like the Echo Kalphite Queen? Like how does that work? I'm sure we all hate the chip damage of that boss, and Echo KQ like let you interact with the boss a little bit better. So it's like, do we just replace it? Do we have it side by side? Is it almost like the Phosani's Kalphite Queen, you know, the equivalent? Like, how does it actually fit into the game? And I'm sure Ed will have to come up with some spin on the narrative to justify this thing's existence, but it is a good idea of like, what do we actually do with that going forward? I don't know if Rice, you got anything to expand on that?
Yeah, I think it's indicative of like the opportunities that we have in the game. You know, the stuff we're doing with Abyssal Sire, like in a way, that's kind of what the Echo Kalphite Queen did with the Kalphite Queen. It's like, okay, what would it be like to fight a giant lightning bug, but it's fun this time? That's what the League 5 Echo boss was about, and we can do that with Sire. We can do it with more things. So, you know, maybe the reimagining of Kalphite Queen isn't exactly the Echo boss, but maybe it is something that is like taking what was supposed to be appealing about the boss and making it real and tangible. And there are places where it obviously isn't as needed, like the Hundler fight. That was like 2 extra mechanics, some tornadoes going around, a new type of attack where you turn your prayer off. It didn't need much more to make it like more interesting because it already has a lot going on. So there are places where we can really like elevate the fight by doing a little bit, and places where we don't make much of a difference by doing a little bit. So yeah, I'd be a huge fan of looking through some of those old bosses and seeing where can we do an Echo Kalphite Queen type thing and really make this content feel like a part of the modern game.
Yeah.
The Corrupted Gauntlet has never been as popular, though.
Yeah.
I think it was popular because you didn't have to do the prep.
Yeah.
But cool. Okay, so this is quite a fun topic. So, like, general habits of over-designing. And I think this goes into, like, a bit of pride as well. I think pride is the downfall of most designers, where you get really attached to ideas, and you basically almost make something that's just not too good, but you love the idea, and you had a lot of fun designing it, and there's always that level of stubbornness of not wanting to change it, and like it almost like giving in to the player's whims. And I think it's just purely hurtful. I don't think that is ever the right thing to do, and I think it's something that every designer goes through in their career, where they start off, they're really proud of their own work, but they end up just making things that are just worse, and they don't want to change them. And it's really easy to get into these habits, and we have to constantly rein ourselves back in. We do have a slide on like simplicity versus like complex designs, but I don't know if like Mack, you've had an experience of like just having a boss and just doing too much.
This is something that I struggle with so much. As a designer, one thing you really want is for your encounter to feel like there's a lot going on, because you're playing through it and you feel like there's not enough happening. So the habit really is to throw just more mechanics in, get the player doing more. And it's just not always a solution. It doesn't always feel fun. So yeah, it really is just a process of pulling things back a lot, and just getting like the core loop feeling good as a starting point. Yeah.
I'm going to throw you under the bus here, Kieren. So, Grotesque Guardians. Grotesque Guardians Grotesque Guardians is one of my favorite bosses. I like 3600 KC, going for the pet, never got it, then quit the game. But great boss, loved it. But I do think that this is a boss that is really ripe for like being over-designed, and like it had those like forced cutscenes, and then the transition phases where you had to dodge lining, like really long and everything. And a lot of the mechanics force you to interact with them in a really specific way. And it felt like, it just didn't feel like a Slayer boss, in reality.
That's another aspect of it, I think. Like, a boss design that works as a Slayer boss is also different to a standalone boss. Like, you think of your Slayer routine, it's task, 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 task. You want to get through it with some pace. When you get a boss task, you don't want it to feel like some burden that's going to feel like it takes you all week to get through. And so a boss that takes what Grotesque Guardians was at launch, and it took as long as it did, doesn't really fit into that rhythm very well. And you just got sick of it. We all did. We all experienced that.
Yep.
We maybe managed it for one task, and then the second time you got it, you're just kind of like, whatever. The rewards aren't even that good. I'll do regular gargoyles, which, you know, we all know regular gargoyles loot. Probably too good, but we all like it anyway.
Yeah.
But, I mean, even Great Olm, like, I felt that when this over-designing aspect, when I was working on the Olm, there's a reason the Olm has its 3 different, like, elemental styles, you know, flame, acid, crystal. Basically, it came from coming up with lots of different mechanic ideas that the Olm could do, and then realizing, I have way too long of a list. And I like the ideas, so instead I decided to turn that into a way where the Olm basically randomizes which set of mechanics it comes out with each time it pops up. But because the fight goes up and down multiple times, you do get to experience it all. But it worked quite well, actually, as a way to sort of counter this feeling of it feeling over-designed.
I took that as a bit of inspiration for Araxor as well, where like it just has like one acid special attack like per kill, and you know which one it's going to be. It's all predictable and everything like that in some sense, but you just don't have so much going on that demands your attention, because you do want to turn your brain off eventually.
Yeah.
Can I just chip in and say that's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from these guys, because I'm starting out more so than any of them, is you get these like cool ideas in your head, and you're like, this is such a cool idea, I want to do it now. And it's like, dude, the game's going to be around for decades. You're going to get a chance to do all of this cool stuff. Slow down. I don't know if any of you have read the wiki page for Tormented Demons. The list of mechanics is so long. Like, each of those could have been its own Slayer monster, and instead they're all in one place. And like, that's a learning for me of like, just split it up and be patient. Like, we'll get the chance to explore all the cool stuff.
It is like a weird rush, right? Like, you have so many ideas and you want to get them into every single update, but yeah, we are going to be around for a long time.
It's a bit of a cliche game design advice, really, but simplicity is king, and it really does apply to bosses. Simple works. But understanding, I mean, you were talking about Tomes of Masca earlier, like those bosses feel like they could all be finale bosses or standalone bosses.
Especially Akka.
Yeah. Stuff like Zarpus in Theatre of Blood, or some of the ones in Chambers of Xeric, they're just a bit of a gimmick, right? But it works in what it is. It has a simple gimmick, a simple idea. You know, if you stand in the way that Zarpus is looking and attack it, you all know what happens. But it's still funny. It's really simple, and you all laugh at your teammates when they mess it up.
All the time.
Nearly swore there.
I mean, that's where the hard mode Zarpus came in as well. It was like, how do we just make this more chaotic? But in some sort of sense, it actually went a bit less chaotic as well.
A really recent memory of over-designing for me, and it's still a pain point. I still see people mentioning this on the Reddit, and that is the chariots from the Colosseum, these like moving blocking things.
Oh, yeah.
I see people asking where they went. We'd figured it out, we designed it, and on paper it worked. We came to implement it, and it just wasn't fun. We had this idea that you'd like pull the ranger and move across the arena with him following you, and it broke the fight. It killed the pace, and it just wasn't a good move. So that ended up being pulled. But that's a good example of over-designing, I think.
100%. Power creep, spicy topic. So power creep is like a twofold problem. Obviously, we have like rewards, and people want new rewards. We have to give you new exciting rewards to chase for all the time, right? And finding that balance of like how much extra strength bonus, or how much DPS, or how much defense, whatever, the appropriate amount for like content is always a challenge, as we see. Like, we very rarely put out a rewards blog that just goes first try, right? Like, very, very rarely. It's like 2 or 3 iterations or more. So that's its own challenge, but it also comes with a challenge of like the actual content itself. It's like, this is very much like gut feel, but for me, if a player has less than like 70% accuracy on a boss, it just feels miserable. Like it feels so bad, especially like special attacks and stuff. If you miss your special attack time and time again, it just feels miserable. But we also need to push up defense to justify bigger rewards. So like, we might add like, say, the Osmundson's Fang, that's a really, really accurate weapon. That gives us a bit of leeway now to push up the defense of monsters without it feeling like you're really inaccurate. If we ever get that wrong and we release a boss with like mega defense, it's just abrasive. And we've seen that with Tecton over the years, right? Like we've nerfed that thing's defense like 4 times, and now it's like guaranteed Warhammers, guaranteed Bandos God specs and everything, just to make that feel tolerable. But we do need to keep pushing up defense and releasing rewards that let you subjugate that defense, so then progression still matters. But it's such a tenuous balance that we've not always got right. But it is kind of an important thing we keep in mind. Then if anyone wants to expand on that, designing rewards.
I want to thank you personally, Arcane, for creating Duke Sakellus and making my life easy when designing an upgrade for the Arclight. Because the fact that Duke has such high defense means brilliant. I can slap a bunch of slash accuracy on this thing, and everyone's going to love it. And so that's really the reason why we sometimes want to do high defense bosses, is because it makes for exciting rewards in the future. Yeah. I do also think there's like an element here of, like, we want to power creep, but we talked in the narrative talk about like making sure the game is recognizable. So it's like this balance of like pushing the game forwards and making people feel more powerful, but still make it so that someone who played 15 years ago can log in and go like, oh yeah, this is the game I remember. There's not like a melee armor set that gives me 640 melee strength or something like that. It's just like completely different.
100%. Rigid versus free-flowing counters. So this is something that's a bit of like a new thing for me, and something I've been trying to verbalize a little bit recently is, I think Ulm might have been the first one of these. And like what I mean by this is, TOA has a lot of bosses that have like very specific, like, oh, at this health threshold, this special attack happens. At this health threshold, this happens. It'll speed up over the course of the fight. We'll have an enrage of 20%. It'll do a special attack every 5 attacks. These are quite rigid fights, and they're very structured, they're very scripted, and they can be really good in their own right, but it's very much a formula that can end up feeling quite repetitive, and we need to be careful not to go in those. And I'm also not convinced they're necessarily better. I don't think they're easier to design, I don't think they're more fun to engage with, and this is where we come with like the Great Ulm. The Great Ulm's got like you said, it's got like 12, 15 mechanics or something like that. But there's so many different combinations. Like you might get the acid bomb at a certain time in combination with like lightning or the healing on the hands, or one of your friends gets trapped in a flame wall or something like that. All these like really simple mechanics that layer up in really interesting ways that makes the fight feel quite dynamic and different every single time you do it. Like I've done hundreds and hundreds of solo Chambers of Xeric, and like each one does actually feel quite different, even though you're just skipping half the special attacks. And this is kind of what I mean by a free-flowing counter. There's so many mechanics that work in different combinations at different times, it ends up just not feeling scripted. And I think that's just really exciting. And I've been trying this a bit recently. Vardorvis is a bit like this as well, where there's no real structure to it, just things kind of happen and ramp up, and you don't really know exactly when certain things are going to happen. Araxor's like this, with like the different combinations of the Araxites that come in the minions, as well as the different venom attacks. Like these layer up in like different and more interesting ways. I think generally, these can be easier to design and just are generally more fun. Like we've kind of seen this. I think people quite like Verdorvis and Araxor. Yeah. So I'm hoping that's a bit of proof that this kind of design's great, because I still think, again, Ulm is one of the best encounters in the game, especially solo. I don't know if obviously your experience with our Ulm, Kieren, like designing that originally.
I mean, honestly, like, not necessarily with Ulm, but like, I think it's important that a fight doesn't just feel like this very scripted flow and you go through the exact same 10 steps every single time. And the other thing is, I feel like it should be quite open to having multiple solutions to solve the different problems. And I mean, maybe we come back a little bit to over-designing, but the more complex like a boss mechanic is, the more specific the solution ends up being for like actually dealing with it, whether that's dodging it or attacking it in the right way or whatever it is. So to me, I want it to be as open as possible generally, and give teams, give solo players more tools to solve it. And I think it just always feels better, pretty consistently.
I always love it when players come up with the weirdest creative ways of interacting with mechanics. And while this isn't necessarily a slide, I think it's somewhat related. Like we've seen this time and time again where we'll release an update and a player finds a really weird way of interacting with a boss, like the step-back mechanic of Muspa, axe skipping of Vardorvis, maybe even skipping specials to the extent of the Great Olm, right? And some of these just make the fights better, right, in every way. And we really need to embrace that. And it's very easy for us to just go like, they're doing it in the non-intended way, we need to stop this. And sometimes that is the right call, because it might just be making the fight worse, but often it makes the fight better. Like, I do think Muspa is better with a step mechanic. I do think Vardorvis is better when we also skip axes. It just, again, more ways of interacting with mechanics is just interesting. The Araxor self-damage thing and the Enrage as well. Again, it was doing way too much damage, is insane. But yeah, it's just a better way of interacting with a fight. It can be quite exciting. We do need to embrace those more, and I think we are learning that.
I remember on TOA, you saying that we need to try and find more ways of interacting, weird little ways of interacting with the bosses. It's difficult. It's difficult to find these things, and we often just rely on you guys to find these interactions.
You guys know the game better than we do a lot of the time, especially like core engine interactions. It's like, I have no idea this is possible. Okay, sure, fair enough. Cool. That was it for the general chat. Obviously, feel free to grab us later, but for now, we've got Q&A. I don't know if we've got any questions lined up. I don't actually know where I'm looking. I can barely see anything. Hello.
Hey team, Swiftly from New Zealand. The term aspirational has been said quite a few times, particularly by you, Arcane, in terms of difficulty. I think we have a collective agreement that what is aspirational for some people is not aspirational for others. So with players getting better and the skill ceiling growing, how is the difficulty of bosses determined amongst the broad range of players' skills? And without giving too much away, what metrics are used during the design phase to determine the difficulty of future bosses?
I'm going to give like a really unprofessional response, but it's kind of just gut feel for a lot of that. Like a lot of it is like, we play the game, we know the game, we talk to players, we get a lot of vibes from you guys, and we just hope that we're kind of aiming in the right direction. But yeah, aspirational is like a really big term. Aspirational content is really important for us to have. Aspirational content is the reason I'm even here. Like, the Inferno being released, I remember seeing the trailer and everything, and I was like, I want to do that. That's cool, right? And I started playing the game a lot, and then obviously I ended up applying and everything. And stuff like that's so important for the game to even work. But in terms of aspirational for some and aspirational for others, I don't know what the game's going to look like in 10 years in terms of like, we can't expect everyone to be clicking 6 times in a tick. Like, that ends up being insane, right? Like, the Awakened Leviathan, that's already like almost a peak limit, right? Where you're like moving every tick and changing your prayers, like it's crazy. So mechanically, there probably is like a hard ceiling, but I think there's a lot we can do like strategically and in terms of like learning mechanics, reading mechanics, understanding mechanics. I think we can still push that somewhat, but there's also just gear, right? Like we can push the gear like requirements up a little bit, make things harder. But that being said, what was the latest Inferno cape with like a willow shortbow or something like that? Does gear really matter? I'm not sure.
Well, with time, everything gets easier, right, generally. Just better gear comes out, you have more powerful weapons, it's easier to take down these difficult fights. But, like, aspiration is different for everybody, but this game is about progression. You need those things that you want to try and get to, whether that's getting new gear unlocks to get to it, whether it's getting the new skills to get access to something else. Like, that's how the game works, I think. That's why it feels so satisfying to get to these things. So, to me, we just want a good spread of different difficulties of boss content. And when we spot a gap and we think there's a gap to fill, that'll generally be where we try and go. So we had a big, massive haul with mid-game bosses. They're not necessarily aspirational, but like that was a gap we needed to fill to really help people who maybe do want to aspire to like even just beating Theatre of Blood or something like that. There's now a bit of a pathway to actually learn some of the ideas and mechanics that are common in most late-game, end-game boss fights.
And to the point of pushing the skill ceiling, we talked a little bit about how the players interact with the game and finding new ways for people to interact with bosses. It's often in like finding subtle things, like everybody knows how to change prayers. How many people are used to turning their prayers off? usually a mechanic turns your prayer off for you. That was a little experimentation we did with the Hunleth in Leagues 5. It's like, okay, what would it feel like? Would it actually feel dramatically different to be like, oh, I need to turn my prayer off rather than on? It's not a huge difference in the way that you're clicking, but there's sort of like a mindset change that needs to happen. It throws you off a little bit, enough that there's a risk that you'll make a mistake. And finding new ways for players to interact with the game is a big part of it, and we can certainly explore that space further.
I don't know where I'm looking.
Is it me? Just a couple of, I guess, your thoughts. Grindable bosses, would it be a bad idea to have a guaranteed untradeable drop at a certain kill count level that massively speeds up certain kills? So you might get, example, 400 Vorkov KC, you get the head guaranteed at 50, get at 500 a spell scroll for undead Vorkov, that damages 100 damage at the start of the fight, just to make it a bit more fun, encourage you to keep that grind going on and get that pat. Or poison potions that might hit 50-50-50 on another boss that's specific only to that boss. Untradeable, just fun little items that could be added to the drop tables for those unbearable grinds. Another one for echo bosses, the Shadow Realm exists. Could they be in the Shadow Realm as an echo boss? With the Whisperer teleport that you use during that boss, could you stand outside the boss room of KBD and teleport to the Shadow Realm to access the Echo variant? And Powercreep, Side Creep, which is what's been done with the Demon Bane stuff, which works really well. What's your thoughts on these things?
I struggled to hear a lot of that, but was the general vibe around guaranteed untradeable drops at certain bosses that just help the specific grind certain bosses?
Yeah, that was the first one, and then just echo bosses in Shadow Realm, that the option could be there for them as well, what you brought up earlier.
Sorry, I didn't hear the second one again.
Echo bosses in the Shadow Realm. So with the teleport you use for Whisperer, you could use that outside the KBD lair or Calpite Queen lair, and those bosses could be lurking in that area.
Yeah, that could be a cool thematic for the echo bosses.
Whoa. Okay, narrative. That's getting sketchy.
I'm not the narrative guy. I just do the bosses, right? So you guys could figure that out.
Just come up with cool ideas and get the narrative guys to solve our problems.
But yeah, that is definitely one direction we could take it in.
Mod Ed is out there somewhere. Go and pitch it to him.
Pulling his hair out.
Yeah. In terms of the guaranteed untradeable drops, yeah, I think we generally quite like that, as long as it's an appropriate reward. We've done this a couple of times, right, with the Vorkath head and things like that. I think we could definitely push that further in different directions. I think it's nice, and it's definitely not necessarily a problem, but something we've witnessed a bit in the past, where if content doesn't have some sort of guarantee, or not necessarily guarantee, but some sort of untradeable drop, it's very easy for a lot of accounts to just completely skip the content. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's good to have a really massive game with different route routing and options, and you can figure out what you want to do, I do feel like it's quite nice to have a little checklist of yeah, I'll go do that content, I'll get my Elidinus pouch, Divine Rune pouch, I can't remember what it's called, the Rune pouch from TOA, just check that off. It's a fairly common drop, and it's a really nice account upgrade. I think those generally just enhance the experience for player, right? Being able to go around and just do everything a little bit, right? So I do think we could do more with that for sure.
Our next question.
Yeah.
With Yama and Royal Titans being duo focus, is this something you're going to focus on more with Raids 4 being forced team content of 3 or more? It never really made sense to me for having Chambers be most efficient to solo. So will Raids 4 be a team raid where you have to be in a team of 3 or more, for example?
Was the question, will Raids 4 be a team focused raid, or?
Yeah, dedicated roles, you can't just solo it and it'd be a bit harder. You have to be in a team.
I'm going to be brazen and just say Raids 4 will be a boss rush style TOB-esque content. they'll fire me.
You heard it here
Not after
first.
that cheer. Like,
We
Now
heard
we're
it here
locked
first
in.
either as well.
but no, we know that's what people. We knew that's what people want from the next raid. I think, like, honestly, when I look back at Tombs of Amaska, I don't necessarily like how much it's become this really solo experience. Like, I want raids to feel like it can be something you can genuinely do in a group and feel good doing in a group. It's not like it's a problem. Like, it's a good thing that if people still enjoy it, not going to complain. But I do want a raid to feel like I can do this in a group. It's aimed at groups and feels right for that, like Theatre of Blood.
Yep. Cool. Hi. I was. Yeah.
Where are we looking?
Over
Over here.
Yeah. I was just wondering about combat achievement speed times, how they're sort of determined, because obviously the tasks don't come out for a bit after the bosses are dropped and whatnot. Do you see like what the fastest times the community are doing, slash it by a bit, see what the average is, or is there some other way you determine them?
It goes case by case, but generally I'll look at like, what are the world records and like what are people generally doing like consistently with like really top end gear, and then you're just trying to lower it by an appropriate amount after that. It's really hard to get them right because if they're too easy, they might as well not exist. Like if you just go there 2 kills with like any gear and you just got the best assault time, it feels kind of pointless. But then there's some bosses that don't really have a lot to like engage with. Like you're at the sheer whim of RNG, right? And you're just sat there and just hoping you hit high enough. And just having a really tight time on that also isn't particularly interesting. So yeah, I don't think we've necessarily got like speed times quite right. Not necessarily in the numbers themselves, but our approach to it. I quite like what we did with Araxor, where it was like average over 5 kills kind of thing. So like, can you kill 5 Araxors in like 8 minutes or whatever the number was? I feel like that's better. It gets away from like the whole like ZCB, Ruby Bolt specking, like resetting. That's not fun. No one really enjoys that. I think generally goes towards a better direction. So if you generally like that, we can keep going in that direction. Open for feedback.
It's worth noting too, we do have GMs on the team, so oftentimes it's kind of like finding a point that they're comfortable with, and then toning it down just slightly to get that sweet spot.
I think there's a general theme with a couple of the questions where there's like a desire to know, like, oh, what's the mathematical equation that leads to the correct decision? And it's like, sorry, it's vibes-based. Like, it's really, a lot of the time, it's just finger to the wind. But that's why iteration is so important, right? We do something, we make a mistake, players tell us we've made a mistake, we do better next time. Slowly refine it until we get something better and better each time.
Agree.
Hi, just want to say thank you for all that you do. And my question is, with the introduction of Raging Echoes, we saw different styles of bosses being done in different ways. Is there any plan to bring that sort of stuff to the main game? And sort of adjacent to that, how important is narrative with the design of a boss, and with things like Xanaris? Are we going to see bosses where narrative isn't a factor and we're just trying to have the best boss experience possible?
I probably can't speak too much onto Xanaris itself, because that's very much a sandbox, right? Like, I'm not going to be the ones dictating what people create in that environment. In terms of Raging Echoes, yeah, that is definitely a topic, right? Like, can we bring them to the main game? Is it right to bring them into the main game? Is it better as just like a Leagues thing? Is there ways to improve the existing bosses inspired by the Echo bosses without necessarily just backporting them almost? So it's definitely a conversation to be had, but we're open to exploring that for sure. In terms of like narrative and like how much that defines things, a lot of the time it's very much like inspiration driven, where the narrative will inspire us. Like with Yama, like what will a giant demon wielding an axe do, right? Like how does that actually inspire the mechanics, and we can make that fit. It should never be a crutch. They should definitely complement each other, and it can go back and forth, where someone might have a really good narrative idea that influences the mechanics. I might have a really good mechanical idea that influences the design, right? And the best things we create with the artists, narrative, the entire team in general, is just bouncing back and just coming out the other end with something great. So it should never feel like it's hindering it at all.
For me, that's consistently what produces the best stuff, is like, we talk about like, oh yeah, there's this thing that we want to do, and then an artist makes like an incredible piece of concept art and puts it in front of you. You go like, oh my god, I can see it. I can see it moving. I can see it swinging the axe. I can see exactly how it's going to interact with the player. It inspires you. I mean, it's creativity, right? Like we're a team. We work together, and that's what produces the best results.
I'm sure it varies between designers, but personally, I find that art and narrative is super important to my designs. With Soul from the Colosseum, for example, I had the anims before I had a lot of the gameplay design. So I saw his big spear thrust attack, and I figured, okay, what can we do with that? And it kind of turned naturally into this sort of dance that you're doing with him, which just felt really appropriate for like a big combat warrior guy. Worked really well, so personally, I'm really into it.
It communicates personality as well. It's not necessarily mechanics, right? We were like Saul's going to have an attitude, right? Like he's going to have a bit of a personality, and that can influence mechanics, but can also just influence like how the player interacts with them throughout the actual gameplay.
I was talking to Mod Hend about this. Leviathan, you could strip away that entire fight and just have a blue box, a green box, and a red box, and you have to click them at the right time. That would be it. That'd be like basically the whole fight. And that would be no fun. Nobody would enjoy that. Really, the thematics are super important to like making it feel like what you're doing has purpose, what you're doing is fun. You're killing a giant fish thing. Like, it's awesome because it's a giant fish thing, not because you clicked the correct button at the correct time.
We reuse mechanics so much. Like, everyone's familiar with falling rocks, right? We do it all the time. It's just how you frame that. Our whole game is just damaging tiles and being hit by projectiles, but it's just how do you spin the thematics to make that feel fun?
So you spoke about how interaction with mechanics like step under a Raxor. How do you guys as designers feel about high-level content having to interact with it in a certain way, like high-level TOA where you have to butterfly Akka or red X Barber? How do you guys feel about that?
I think ideally it never feels forced, and it just feels like an option. And if people want to optimize, and that's like the efficient way to do it, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. If people feel forced and like it's the only actual valid option, then that's a problem, and we should try and have more diversity in reality. But it's also always contextual, it's always case by case, but again, we're always open to feedback on that.
Hey, I had a question about the rewards for Raids 4, since it is going to be released.
Early.
And, well, it's not about specific things, but more about the idea of designing it, because we obviously know about Fang being pretty strong, being nerfed, being changed, and the Shadow obviously being very apparent in a lot of, well, PVM content. So is there anything you took away from this to design the next piece of content? Because we also have a lot of side grades, a bit of saturation. So it's a bit difficult, of course, to also create a lot more power creep in that regard.
Is the question, like, what have you learned from like TOA? Is like a drop table, and like how are you going to take that forward, or?
That, and also what kind of weapon or armor design do you have in mind?
Spoilers. Yeah, no chance, mate. Good try, though.
What do you want?
What would I want? Honestly, there's a lot of things, but the thing I'd probably like the most is something that's, well, heavy and hard-hitting. I love Dark Souls, I love just playing the two-hand big sword, but it's also very difficult with the tick system, so that'd be cool.
Yeah. Again, so it's an open box, right? So we're going to have to discover that. The Fang is very, very strong, potentially too strong. Quite funny at the time that everyone was like, this reward is going to be dead content on release, and it ends up being one of the best melee weapons created. The Shadow was very much the desire from the Heka. It was like, we need something better. We don't really have a justified mega rare for this raid, and that's why the Shadow got born, potentially too strong as well. Did have a really nice side effect on all magic armor. Like, magic armor went up massively from the Shadow, which is a really nice benefit. It gives love to Chambers of Zarek and all the other pieces of content that actually drop that. But yeah, in terms of power creep, it's really difficult. We just need to get better and iterate, and just hopefully Raids 4 rewards are a banger as well.
I mean, we know it's a challenge, right? Because we've got our big range weapon, we've got our big melee weapon. You know, we've got all three. So that is going to be a question we have to answer at some point. We haven't answered it yet, right? I think we've got some semblances early ideas, but like we're not at the point that we're going to that stage yet. But obviously, it'll be a conversation back and forward with players, as it always is with blogs. I'd be blown away if we get it right on the first blog. That's just normal, and it's that process that gets us to the right answer. So.
But if anyone does have a mega rare or an armor set idea, DM me, please. Pardon? Salamander. Oh, great idea, yeah. Mega rare salamander.
Did you not see my message about the hat that you wear that's a cannon that is just like a cannon that moves with you?
Yeah,
and fires
portable cannon, yeah.
Yeah.
But you won't be able to use that anywhere because we disable it constantly.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
So my question is one about scale. So we had Cox up to 100 people, we had Top up to 5, and then Toa up to 8. What time in the design process do you guys decide on scale? And do you think that 100 people was a mistake that you won't make again, or do you think that eventually we will see a raid that allows for up to 100?
I think the 100 scale system from Chambers is our best yet, and there's very little downside. Outside of just tech constraints, there's a lot of benefits for us when it's a smaller group and like handling you all and moving you around between the different rooms and stuff. So it's mainly a tech thing, not like a gameplay thing mostly. But I do want to see if Raids 4 kind of have like the 1 to 100 because like mass scales are amazing. They're just so much fun.
I think this is our last question.
Yep.
How do combat achievements affect or influence your boss design? Or at what point in the boss designs are you thinking about combat achievements? I'm particularly interested in specific combat achievements like Fremnik Way or the Salamander Kriar Kill, where you basically make the boss fight in a different way, or it changes the way you are fighting against the boss.
Yeah, I feel like it's actually quite a simple answer. We'll generally finish the content and then start looking at combat achievements afterwards and go like, what would fit for this? What would make it interesting? Like, what would be a fun combat achievement to go for? What would be a grueling one that might feel really satisfying to do afterwards? So there's a lot of variety there, and we don't always get it right. But generally, it's like make the content and then think about the combat achievements afterwards, see what fits, what would be interesting, and what not. I don't know if, Mack, you had any conversation about the Colosseum ones. I think you did those ones.
Yeah, in my personal experience, it's always after the content's finished, like you say. We have a GM on the team. Again, like I say, we normally sync up with him, see what he thinks might work, and then sort of designify that to be a bit more player-friendly.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think we're out of time for questions, but I've got one more question back to the audience. I wanted to do a very quick little poll for which raid people like most. So, if you like Chambers as Eric, can you cheer? What about TOB?
I think that's unanimous. You don't need to ask.
Yeah. And Toa? All right. Good feedback. Thank you all.
Thank you.